Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, the most famous rock song of all time, contains a satanic message when played backwards.
Yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on.
Led Zeppelin is the biggest-selling hard rock band of all time. The founder of the band was Jimmy Page. Page was extremely interested in the occult and magic. Quote, encountering his writings for the first time at age 11, Page immersed himself in Aleister Crowley's writings as a teen and young man. He began collecting rare magic books. He opened an occult bookstore in London called Equinox. Led Zeppelin's 1976 album called Presence features a family sitting around a table staring at a black obelisk. The obelisk is an occult symbol.
However, I've read books and spent a lot of time reading books on mysticism of Eastern and Western traditions and comparative religions. And then astrology, etc.
Page's fascination with Crowley led many to believe he was into black magic himself.
I think he was absolutely fascinated with the man and the knowledge of the will. He owned a lot of manuscripts, and he bought the Inverness Castle. That was also Crowley's. And I think with it, he had purchased a lot of manuscripts. And at one point he had a bookstore in English, an occult bookstore. And he was really more fascinated by the knowledge of it.
It was a sincere fascination, and I think he took a lot out of it. He was very interested in those types of things, otherworldly things.
By age 15, Jimmy Page had become a devout follower of occultist magician Aleister Crowley, who was dubbed the wickedest man in the world. But it wasn't until the release of Zeppelin III that Page revealed his interest in the dark side. In 1971, Page attended a Sotheby's auction by Crowley's estate, where he met filmmaker Kenneth Anger. The two become friendly. Page purchases Crowley's Bullockskeen house, located on the shores of Loch Ness next to a graveyard. A house which was once a church that burned to the ground while the congregation was inside.
Crowley's motto of "Do what thou wilt" was inscribed on the vinyl of Led Zeppelin's album Led Zeppelin III. Jimmy Page was a collector of Aleister Crowley's memorabilia who, quote, had read a lot of Crowley and was fascinated by his ideas. Page encountered Crowley's writings at age 11 and later bought Crowley's home. Page said he believed Crowley's home would be a good atmosphere in which to write songs. Page did everything he could to return the house to how it would have looked during Crowley's ownership. Page commissioned an artist to paint some Crowley-esque murals on the walls. For a certain period of time, Page left the home in the care of his friend Malcolm Dent. Although Dent was a skeptic of the, quote, paranormal, he soon started to experience strange occurrences. After a few weeks, he heard strange rumblings from the hallway, which stopped when he investigated, but resumed after he had closed the bedroom door. Dent awoke one night to hear what sounded like a wild animal snorting and banging outside his bedroom door. It went on for some time, and it was not until morning that Dent dared to open the bedroom door. When he did, there was nothing there. Dent added, quote, whatever was there was pure evil. Another friend who had stayed at the home awoke one night claiming she had been attacked by some kind of devil. There were other occurrences such as chairs switching places, doors slamming open and closed for no reason, and carpets and rugs rolling up inexplicably.
Page's childhood friend Malcolm Dent stayed there for 20 years before Page sold the place. As he told the Inverness Courier in a 2006 interview, doors would be slamming all night. You'd go into a room and carpets and rugs would be piled up. Even though he's a self-described skeptic, Dent couldn't explain why any of this was happening.
In 1975, gave an interview to Rolling Stones magazine where he describes some of the feelings he got from the haunted monument. When the interviewer went on to clarify that Page himself never had contact with the spirits, Page cut in with, "I didn't say that." He went on to tell the interviewer that he preferred not to discuss the issue further.
On March 20th, 2012, Jimmy Page released an album called Lucifer Rising and Other Soundtracks. It contained music that Page produced but never used for Kenneth Anger's film Lucifer Rising.
Page subsequently committed to performing the musical score of Anger's film, Lucifer Rising. Lucifer Rising began production in 1967, but was plagued by tragedy. A 5-year-old boy named Goddard, cast to play the Lucifer child, leapt from his apartment window to his death. Bobby Beausoleil, cast to play the Lucifer teen, joined the Manson family and murdered schoolteacher Gary Hinman.
On Jimmy Page's website, he says these music tracks, which were originally produced in the early 1970s, quote, have been revisited, remixed, and released for the first time. Page lists some of the tracks on the album, titles like Lucifer Rising and Incubus. Incubus is considered to be the name of a demon. Many of the most well-known rock musicians in history were fans or had a devotion to the Satanist Crowley. According to Beatles drummer Ringo Starr, the cover of their Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club album showed people the Beatles liked and admired. This included the Satanist Aleister Crowley. The Doors had a picture of Crowley on their album cover.
In the 1960s, the Rolling Stones and their entourage made major steps in advancing Crowley's Satanic Revolution. They worked with the Beatles and one of Crowley's most rabid disciples, Kenneth Anger, to promote Crowley's new age of Antichrist. Incredibly, Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones did the sound for Kenneth Anger's movie Invocation of My Demon Brother, promoting Aleister Crowley's Satanism. Kenneth Anger described the film as, quote, the shadowing forth of the Lord Lucifer as the powers gather at a midnight mass. Both Mick Jagger and Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones appear as seen here in Anger's film. Tony Sanchez, who lived with the Rolling Stones, related how Jagger, Richards, and their girlfriends, Faithful and Pallenberg, quote, listened spellbound as Anger turned them on to Crowley's powers and ideas. We have already observed that Keith Richards boasted that, quote, Kenneth Anger told me I was his right-hand man. Jagger's girlfriend, Marian Faithfull, said that Jagger harnessed all of the negative forces into entities: Lucifer, Jumping Jack Flash, the dark, violent group mind of the crowd chaos, Pan, terms used by Crowley for his Satanic Revolution in his books. She said that frenzied power caused many of the casualties of the 60s. Kenneth Anger's demonic movies were basically a promotion of Crowley's satanic philosophy of do what thou wilt. Here we see Kenneth Anger dancing around with a goat's head, which is a powerful symbol in Satanism even to this day. Subsequent to this movie, the Rolling Stones would put out an album called Goat's Head Soup. John Lennon of the Beatles, who knew Kenneth Anger, pretended to be a man of peace, but really wanted violent revolution. John Lennon said that the Beatles were as much revolutionaries as the Stones were. Notice John Lennon here after stating, but when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out, then changes out to in, showing the Beatles' true intent for violent revolution.
But when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out?
The Rolling Stones and the Beatles promoted Crowley's Satanic Revolution with their albums, their Satanic Majesty's Request, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. With their Satanic Majesty's Request, the Stones employed the same name for Satan as did Anger's film Lucifer Rising. On the front cover of the album, Mick Jagger is seen dressed like a warlock, and at the top of the album, their Satanic Majesty's Request, we see the alignment of planets supposedly heralding the Crowleyan Satanic Age. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones said at this time, quote, I believe we're moving toward a new age in ideas and events. Astrologically, we are at the end of the age called the Pisces Age. of the beginning of which people like Christ were born. We're soon to begin the age of Aquarius, in which events as important as those at the beginning of Pisces are likely to occur. There is a young revolution in thought and manner about to take place. What few people realize is that their Satanic Majesty's Request was put out in conjunction with the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album to promote the new age of Satan. Both came out in 1967, both were highly psychedelic, and both were poised to take the hippie revolution further down the path of Crowley's Satanic Revolution. Both albums are also heavily adorned with Eastern mystical symbols and drugs. Both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones are wearing uniforms, and both are pictured with deadpan looks upon their faces. Notice on the front cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's is the statement, "Welcome the Rolling Stones." Tony Sanchez wrote in his book Up and Down with the Rolling Stones about a Beatles and Rolling Stones meeting where they talked, quote, long into the night about music and revolution and how they were going to change the world. On the front cover of the Rolling Stones album, their Satanic Majesty's Request, a slightly veiled picture of John Lennon is seen. This same picture is also found on the inside sleeve of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. On the Stones album, we also see a semi-camouflage picture of George Harrison of the Beatles, his head being covered with magic mushrooms, a biblically forbidden doorway to Satan called pharmakia. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album is covered with a collage of people known as the Magic Crowd. These are the faces of different people that the Beatles considered part of the mystical club. The Beatles described them as their heroes and people they looked up to. In this crowd, you find pictures of one-worlders like Karl Marx and mystics like Edgar Allan Poe and Carl Jung and Aldous Huxley, who Crowley reportedly turned on to mescaline. The Beatles also placed a picture of occultist William Burroughs, who claimed to have become demon-possessed after killing his wife on the Sgt. Pepper's album. Also making the cast was the most popular starlet of the 1960s, Jane Mansfield. Mansfield was a high priestess in Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. Mansfield admitted to using her Satanism to both seduce and gain worldwide fame. The Beatles also placed a slew of Eastern gurus on the album as they continued their assault on Christianity. Incredibly, one of the people who was to be pictured on the album as part of the Beatles Club was none other than Adolf Hitler. Hitler was yanked presumably because he was considered too controversial to appear on the album. Hitler's picture can be seen on the sidelines just prior to the shooting of the album cover. It has been well documented that Nazism was rooted in the occultic teachings of Madame Blavatsky and others. Aleister Crowley claimed that Hitler was his disciple and was seeking to implement the teachings of the Book of the Law through his policies of the triumph of the will. And of course, as we have noted on the top left, we find the picture of none other than Aleister Crowley. It is believed that Crowley is the one that the Beatles are referring to when in the song Sgt. Pepper's they state it was 20 years ago today that Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. It was 20 years before the release of this album, almost to the day when Crowley died, and many of his followers believed marked the beginning of the New Age. Crowley declared that he would lead an army of youth in the revolution to implement the New Age, and apparently the Beatles dubbed him Sgt. Pepper. John Lennon stated, there were very few things that happened to the Beatles that weren't really well thought out. Lennon said that he realized that he was part of a club of mystics who had been initiated into the same spiritual club. A depiction of the Satanic Church, or the Scarlet Woman, as both Crowley and Anger refer to her, is found on the Sgt. Pepper's album. Crowley taught that the Beast and the Scarlet Woman would gather their children into their fold and bring the glories of the stars into the hearts of men. Notice on the Sgt. Pepper's album, we see a sorceress adorned in scarlet and with precious stones and gold and pearls. Notice also that she is holding up a golden cup in her hand, as the Book of Revelation states. Notice in her other hand she's holding an upside-down pentagram. The London Times said that Sgt. Pepper's was, quote, a decisive moment in the history of Western civilization. It was a decisive moment at this time in history as Satan made major inroads in preparing the world for the coming of the Antichrist. Ringo Starr, on a takeoff from Sgt. Pepper's, put out an album where he is seen with a demon or a fallen angel. Ringo Starr seems to be conveying the idea that he is being influenced by this spirit. In fact, at the top of this album, we see that Ringo Starr depicts himself as merely a puppet on the wizard's hand. Jimi Hendrix, who claimed to be a voodoo child, stated, quote, things like witchcraft, which is a form of exploration and imagination that have been banned by the establishment and called evil, is because people are frightened to find out the full power of the mind. The satanic powers Hendrix unleashed through his music, though, were absolutely destructive. Jimi Hendrix opened himself up to demonic beings who used him to initiate the hippie youth into the counterculture revolution. Alan Douglas, the executive curator of Hendrix's musical estate, admitted his spirit possession.
Now, one of the biggest things about Jimmy was what he believed, and he believed that he was possessed by some spirit, and I got to believe it myself, and that's what we had to deal with all the time. And he was very humble about discussing it with people because he didn't want people to feel like he was being pretentious and so on, but he really believed it, right? And he was wrestling with it constantly.
Jimi Hendrix's live-in girlfriend, Fane Pridgeon, also spoke of Hendrix's admission to being demon-possessed and related his demon possession to the reception of his music.
He used to always talk about some devil or something was in him, you know, and he didn't have any control over it. He didn't know what made him act the way he acted and what made him say the things he said, and songs and different things like that just come out of him, you know. But at first I used to think it was a cop-out when he had really done me in, right? And he'd say, I don't know what come over me, you know, I really can't understand it. And, you know, he used to just, you know, grab his hair or something, or pull his hair and just, or stand in the mirror or cry or something. Oh, it was so sad when he would cry. Maybe he was the first man, or maybe the only man that I've ever seen cry, you know, but it just killed me when he cried, because he felt like, it seems like to me he was so tormented and just torn apart, and like he really was obsessed, you know, with something really evil, you know. And he said, you know, like, you're from Georgia, you know, he said, I should know how, you know, people drive demons out. He actually thought about, you know, if we ever go, because I used to talk about my grandmother and all her weird stuff, you know, and he used to talk about us going down there and having some root lady or somebody see if she could drive this demon out of him.
Make a whole lot of money, gonna be big, yeah.
Jimi Hendrix was used heavily by these demonic forces who channeled their music through him to initiate the West into the drug revolution through songs like Purple Haze, which was about LSD. Jimi Hendrix realized that he was being used by these demonic beings to hypnotize the youth with their music. Hendrix admitted, quote, I can explain everything better through music. You hypnotize people, and when you get people at their weakest point, you can preach into their subconscious is what we want to say. That's why the name Electric Church flashes in and out. Jim Morrison actually named his group The Doors from a mystical reference used first by William Blake and then later by Aldous Huxley. The Doors were just that, spiritual doors to the spiritual world. Morrison viewed himself as a shaman whose role it was to mediate between the demonic world and the counterculture of the 60s. Morrison encouraged them to break on through to the other side. He helped Satan initiate countless multitudes into the world of the occult. Satan picked out Morrison from a very early age and groomed him in the role that he would play to shape Crowley's counterculture revolution in the 1960s. Jim Morrison actually admitted becoming possessed at a very early age. In one song, he refers to the spirits crowding his young, fragile, eggshell mind. In an interview with Jim Morrison that appeared in The Doors' American Prayer album, Jim Morrison elaborates more on the possession experience that took place.
The reaction I get now, thinking about it, looking back, is that the souls of the ghosts of those dead Indians, maybe one or two of them, were just running around, freaking out, and just leaped into my soul. And they're still there.
Even Doors producer Paul Rothchild admitted, quote, this spirit entered Jim's body. That was a pivotal event in his entire life. He always viewed himself as a shaman having mystical powers. It was this power that drove him and turned him into a seer. Here we see Jim Morrison on the front cover of the Doors album 13. And who is he with? None other than the Satanist Aleister Crowley. Jim Morrison echoed Satanist Aleister Crowley's satanic philosophy for the world revolution, do what thou wilt, with his own declaration that there are no rules. Morrison also stated, I feel spiritual up there. Think of us as erotic politicians. I am interested in anything about revolt, disorder, chaos, especially activity that has no meaning. Here we see a picture of Jesus Christ with his disciples at the Last Supper. Below this picture, we see Jim Morrison and his disciples with Aleister Crowley, apparently drawing the conclusion that just as Jesus Christ had his apostles, Aleister Crowley the Satanist has his disciples as well. Jim Morrison recognized that as a songwriter he was only a vehicle, and that he and the rest of the Doors were only open and willing mediums to other forces that were using them.
I can't say too much about it because we're not really making it. It's just kind of making itself.
Morrison said of the picture that you see before you that he felt he looked pretty satanic. In Morrison's song The Soft Parade, he reiterates the theme of selling one's soul to Satan for power and fame. Quote, "You gotta slay a few animals at the crossroads." For Jim Morrison, the crossroads would be UCLA and Venice Beach. After bombing on the finals at UCLA on film, Morrison went down to Venice Beach to live. It was there that Satan would offer him fame and power and fortune as a rock star if Morrison would do his bidding. It was there at Venice Beach, as Jim lived on the roof of an old abandoned building, that Satan communicated music to Jim Morrison, who couldn't even sing at the time, through visions. It was here that Jim Morrison opened his heart up to Satan's vision. Jim Morrison admitted of this experience. In that year, there was an intense visitation of energy. He said, "I left school and went down to the beach to live. I slept on a roof. I met the spirit of music." Who was that spirit? He said, "An appearance of the devil on a Venice canal. Running, I saw Satan." The material that Satan would communicate to Jim Morrison in Venice Beach would become the basis of the Doors' first two albums and would be far more powerful than anything that they would make subsequently to that time. Morrison said, "I was living in this abandoned office building, sleeping on the roof. I just started hearing songs. I heard in my head a whole concert situation with a band and singing and an audience, a large audience. Those first 5 or 6 songs I wrote, I was just taking notes at a fantastic rock concert that was going on inside my head." Jim Morrison, who was incredibly shy and could not sing a lick, went through a demonic transformation on stage as the demons that possessed him sang through him. Ray Manzarek, the Doors keyboard player, points out that Jim Morrison was a shaman.
Jim's contribution to music was that Jim was real. Jim was real on stage. Jim was real when he wrote his songs, when he sang his songs in the studio. He was not a performer. He was not an entertainer. He was not a showman. He was a shaman. He was possessed, man. He was possessed, man. Possessed, man.
Manzarek also stated, "On stage, Morrison came alive and was the most exciting and dynamic performer I'd ever seen. He would go through trips on stage. You wouldn't believe the personalities that would come out of him, the intensity that would speak to the audience." Manzarek went on to say 15,000 people would just be hushed, stopped, not even breathing. "Man, when I was on stage with the guy, I don't know what was playing the organ. Sure, it was my fingers, but," implying that the same forces that took control of Jim Morrison took control of his fingers. Manzarek further stated, "When the Siberian shaman gets ready to go into his trance, all the villagers get together and shake rattles and blow whistles and play whatever instruments they have to send him off. It was the same with the Doors when we played in concert." He said it was like Jim was the electric shaman and we were the electric shaman's band, pounding away behind him. It would take him over. I could hit a chord and make him twitch, and he'd go off again. Sometimes he was just incredible, just amazing, and the audience felt it too. Here we see Jim Morrison doing a shamanistic dance as he sought to open himself up to the spirit world and let the demons use his body. Historically, Satan and demons have used shamans to influence primitive tribes throughout the world. This is similar to the shamanistic dances done by shamans, witch doctors, and voodoo priests throughout human history. The only difference is that Jim Morrison was not simply influencing one tribe, but his music has been used to influence generations and the masses. Like voodoo priests who become possessed as they surrender their bodies to the demonic beings, Jim Morrison exhibited very similar behavior throughout his performances. In the seance, the shaman led, Morrison said, a sensuous panic deliberately evoked through drugs, chants, dancing hurls the shaman into trance. Changed a voice, convulsive movement, he acts like a madman. Jim Morrison understood the process that took place as demonic beings took over his body. Concert footage of the Doors performances gives ample evidence to Manzarek's assertion that different personalities would manifest through Morrison while on stage. In fact, at times one could hear 2 or 3 different demonic beings manifesting through Jim Morrison's body, like the following clip expresses.
No. Run to the mirror in the bathroom, look. He's coming in here. I can't lift you, he's so sick here in the I let my cheeks slide down the cool, smooth tile.
Jim Morrison biographers in the book Break On Through point out that he was, quote, opening himself to be used and abused by any spiritual entity that happened to come along. The result may have been some amazing inspirations, but also a tragically restless and misdirected life. Incredibly, the same spirits that brought Mr. Mojo Rising, as he liked to refer to himself, up to power, also brought him down to destruction. These same demonic beings that used Jim Morrison's body as a puppet to influence the masses would later discard it, as he would die only months after the death of Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. Jim Morrison admitted that he had to drink to silence the constant voices of the demons who were tormenting him. Frank Lisiandro, Doors photographer, stated that, quote, Jim drank to quiet the ceaseless clamor of the demons, ghosts and spirits begging for release. He drank because there were demons and voices and spirits shouting inside his head, and he found that one of the ways to quell them was with alcohol. The same demons who took Jim Morrison down desired to use his body and the body of countless different rock stars to take as many people in the world as possible down with them, including you.
We rock the world!